My life was a collection of meticulously arranged gray boxes. My apartment was gray. My car was gray. My wardrobe, a rotating uniform of charcoal, slate, and dove, was aggressively, unapologetically gray. It wasn't a choice born of aesthetic preference, but of a deep-seated desire not to be noticed. Gray was the color of invisibility, the shade of a man who just wanted to get through the day without leaving a ripple. At Vance and Sterling, I was the quiet graphic designer in the corner, the one who turned in impeccable work and never spoke up in meetings. I was good at my job because it allowed me to communicate through color palettes and typography, a language far more comfortable than the clumsy mechanics of my own voice. And for 5 years, this system had worked. I was a ghost in the machine, reliable and unseen. Then there was Julian Vance. He was the antithesis of my grayscale existence. He wasn't loud or ostentatious, but he was saturated with color. The deep navy of his suits, the crisp white of his shirts, the warm amber of the whiskey he sometimes drank after a successful pitch. He was a man carved from confidence, with a voice that was a low, steady rumble, the kind that could soothe a panicked client or cut through the noise of a boardroom with 2 quiet words. He was the Vance of Vance and Sterling, my boss, and the secret, hopeless focal point of my entire world. My crush on him was a silent, frantic thing, a hummingbird trapped in the cage of my ribs. It was foolish, a violation of every rule I had set for myself, not least of which was the fact that Julian Vance was, by all accounts, impeccably, unassailably straight. He had a rotating, albeit infrequent, series of elegant women who would sometimes meet him for lunch. It was a fact I held onto like a shield. It made my quiet pining safe, a fantasy with no risk of becoming real. The catalyst for the unraveling of my carefully constructed gray world was the flu. Not my flu, but Marcus Holloway's. Marcus was our lead presenter, a man whose charisma was as legendary as his golf handicap. And with the massive Omnicorp pitch, the biggest in our firm's history, less than a week away, Marcus went down hard. Panic rippled through the office. I felt a distant, clinical sympathy for him, but mostly, I was relieved. My part was done. I had spent the last 3 months pouring my soul into the visual campaign, creating a brand identity so sleek and intuitive it practically hummed. My work would be on the screen, but I would be safely in the back of the room, invisible. Or so I thought. I was putting the finishing touches on the final slide deck, the hum of the server room a comforting drone, when a shadow fell over my desk. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. The scent preceded him, a clean, subtle mix of something like cedarwood and bergamot. It was the scent of quiet authority. Leo, Julian's voice was calm, but it held an undercurrent of tension. I finally looked up. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his tailored trousers, his tie loosened just enough to hint at the long day he'd already had. His gaze was direct, and as always, utterly unreadable. It was one of the things that fascinated me most about him. His eyes were a dark, thoughtful brown, but they betrayed nothing. Julian, I managed my own voice sounding thin. Marcus is out. For the week. Doctor's orders, he stated it like a fact from a weather report. You know this campaign better than anyone. Better than I do. You built it from the ground up. A cold dread, slick and oily, began to seep into my stomach. I knew what was coming. I wanted to shrink into my gray sweatshirt until I disappeared entirely. I'm not a presenter, Julian. I'm a designer. Today, you're both, he said, not unkindly, but with a finality that left no room for argument. You and me. We'll walk them through it together. He looked at my screen, at the intricate web of logos and mock-ups I had created. No one can speak to this work like you can. I'll handle the business end. You handle the vision, he paused. We're in the main conference room. Be there in an hour. We'll start walking through the script. He didn't wait for a reply. He simply turned and walked away, leaving me in the echo of his cedarwood scent and the deafening roar of my own pulse. I was no longer a ghost. I had been seen, and I was terrified. The next few days were a blur of forced proximity. My quiet corner became the epicenter of the Omnicorp pitch. Julian pulled his chair over to my desk, and we spent hours hunched over my monitor, the space between us shrinking until I could feel the warmth radiating from his arm. My world, once a solitary, controlled environment, was now constantly occupied by him. I became a scholar of Julian Vance. I learned the way a small muscle in his jaw would tick when he was deep in thought. I learned that he rubbed the back of his neck when he was stressed. I memorized the precise cadence of his breathing, the way it would deepen when he was concentrating on a complex slide. My internal monologue, usually a quiet hum of self-criticism, became a relentless analysis of his every move. He'd bring me a coffee in the morning, his fingers brushing mine as he handed me the cup. It was an accident, my rational brain would say. He's just being a considerate boss. But a wild, hopeful part of me would catalog the brief shock of warmth, the way his gaze seemed to linger for a fraction of a second too long. He'd lean in to point at something on my screen, his breath stirring the hair at my temple, and I would have to physically restrain myself from leaning into the touch. I was drowning in a sea of ambiguous gestures, and my imagination was a traitorous lifeguard, throwing me anchors instead of life preservers. The day of the pitch arrived like a death sentence. I had barely slept, my mind a carousel of anxieties. What if I forgot my lines? What if my voice cracked? What if I threw up on the obscenely expensive conference table? I stood outside the boardroom, clutching my presentation notes in a hand that was slick with sweat. The gray of my suit felt like a costume, a poor imitation of the confidence I was supposed to be projecting. I could feel the tremors starting in my fingers, a familiar and humiliating betrayal by my own nervous system. It was a violent, visible shaking that I couldn't conceal. I tried shoving my hands in my pockets, but it only made my legs feel unsteady. I was going to fail. I was going to humiliate myself and tank the biggest deal in the company's history. The door opened, and Julian stepped out. He was a portrait of calm control in a perfectly fitted charcoal suit. He took one look at me, his eyes dropping to my trembling hands, and a flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. It wasn't pity or annoyance. It was recognition. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" He didn't say, "Calm down." He simply moved to stand beside me, our shoulders almost touching. He looked straight ahead at the polished mahogany door as if we were soldiers about to go into battle. "Stand with me," he said, his voice a low command. Then, he did something that short-circuited my entire brain. He lifted his hand and placed it firmly on my shoulder, just at the base of my neck. It wasn't a patronizing pat. It was a solid, grounding weight. His thumb pressed into the tense muscle there, a small, deliberate circle of pressure. The warmth of his palms seeped through the fabric of my suit jacket, a tide of calm that flowed down my arm and into my shaking fingers. The tremors didn't stop completely, but they subsided, brought under his quiet, physical control. My mind goes blank. All I feel is the weight of his hand, the impossible intimacy of the gesture. He's my boss. He's straight, and he's holding me together with the palm of his hand. "You know the work, Leo," he murmured, his voice for my ears alone. "Just talk about what you made. I'll be right there. Just us." My heart picked up pace, but for a different reason now. It wasn't anxiety. It was something else, something sharp and terrifyingly hopeful. He squeezed my shoulder once, a final, emphatic gesture of support, before dropping his hand. The absence of his touch was immediate and acute, a sudden cold spot on my suit. "Let's go," he said, and pushed open the door. The presentation was an out-of-body experience. I walked in, took my place beside Julian at the front of the room, and opened my mouth. Words came out. They were my words, about my work, but they felt disconnected from me, as if I were a puppet and Julian was the one pulling the strings, his earlier touch still a phantom presence on my shoulder. He was magnificent. He guided the conversation with an easy grace, fielding the difficult questions with unflappable poise. When he'd turn to me, he'd give a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent signal that it was my turn. "Leo can speak to the design philosophy behind that," he would say, and his confidence in me became a temporary armor. At one point, a particularly aggressive executive tried to poke a hole in our branding strategy. I felt a familiar surge of panic, my throat tightening. But before I could spiral, I felt a subtle pressure against my shoe. I glanced down. Julian had shifted his stance, his polished Oxford just barely touching the side of my own. It was a tiny, secret anchor in a sea of hostile faces. I took a breath, grounded by the contact, and delivered my answer with a clarity that surprised even me. We were a team, a unit, and as we concluded the pitch to a round of appreciative nods, I caught his eye. He gave me a look, a quick, intense flash of pride, and something else, something deeper, that made the air in my lungs feel thick and heavy. We won the contract. The news came late that afternoon, and the office erupted. Bottles of champagne were uncorked, and even the most stoic accountants were slapping each other on the back. I accepted the congratulations with a dazed smile, feeling strangely detached from the celebration. The only validation I cared about had come from that one look from Julian. Later, after the initial wave of euphoria had crested, a smaller group of us ended up at a quiet bar downtown. The team was giddy, replaying the highlights of the pitch. I nursed a beer, content to remain in the background again. Eventually, people started to peel off, heading home to their families and their lives. Soon, it was just me and Julian, sitting at the polished wood bar. The noise of the day had finally faded, leaving a comfortable quiet in its place. "You were good up there today, Leo," he said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. He had shed his jacket and tie, and his sleeves were rolled up to his forearms, revealing a dusting of dark hair. "You were better," I replied honestly. "I would have crashed and burned without you." He turned to face me, leaning his elbow on the bar. The playful boss persona was gone, replaced by something more introspective. "You hate it, don't you?" he asked, his voice soft. "The presenting. The spotlight." I was taken aback by the directness of the question. I shrugged, looking down at my beer. "It's not my natural habitat." "Mine neither," he said. My head snapped up. Julian Vance. The man who commanded rooms for a living? My first big pitch, I was about your age. I was so nervous, I spilled an entire glass of water on the client's CEO. Soaked his tie, a faint, self-deprecating smile touched his lips. My boss at the time pulled me aside and told me I didn't have the stomach for this business. I stared at him, trying to picture a younger, less composed Julian. It was impossible. He was sharing a piece of himself, a small, archived failure. It was a moment of vulnerability so unexpected it felt like a gift. "What happened?" I went back in, apologized, and finished the pitch in a wet shirt, he said with a small laugh. "We didn't get the contract. But I learned something. Fear is just a story you tell yourself. You just have to decide to tell a different one." He looked at me, his gaze holding mine. "Today, you told a different story." The moment stretched, thick with unspoken things. The air was charged with something more than just post-victory camaraderie. It was fragile and tentative, and I was terrified of breaking it. He seemed so much closer than he was, his humanity on full display. This wasn't my straight boss, my untouchable fantasy. This was just Julian, a man who had once been scared too. And in that moment, he felt dangerously, breathtakingly real. The next escalation came in an email with the subject line, "Omnicorp on-site, the client, thrilled with our pitch, wanted a weekend-long, immersive workshop to finalize the campaign details. Effective immediately, at a rustic lodge 2 hours north of the city. Attendance was mandatory for the project leads," which meant me, and Julian. A booking error, the email explained with a breezy corporate apology, meant there was only one cabin available on such short notice. A deluxe suite with a shared living space. My blood ran cold. A whole weekend. A shared cabin. The idea was both terrifying and intoxicating. It was a scenario my lonely, pining brain would have cooked up on a Tuesday night, a piece of fanfiction about my own life. Now it was happening. The drive up was quiet. Julian drove, his large hands resting easily on the steering wheel. I watched the city give way to countryside, the gray concrete jungle bleeding into the vibrant greens and golds of autumn. I was a bundle of live wires, hyper-aware of everything. The faint scent of his cologne mingling with the clean air from the open window, the way his thigh was only inches from mine, the low thrum of the engine. The cabin was less of a deluxe suite and more of a single, cavernous room built of dark, fragrant pine. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a plush sofa faced it. On the far side of the room, separated by a token bookshelf, were 2 beds. 2 single, solitary beds that suddenly felt miles apart and yet horrifyingly close. The intimacy of the space was suffocating. "Well," Julian said, dropping his bags by the door with a distinct lack of the awkwardness I was radiating. Cozy, he moved around the space with an easy confidence, as if he shared cabins with his anxious employees all the time. He started a fire, the crackle and pop of the logs filling the tense silence. We worked for a few hours, spread out on the large wooden table, but the pretense of productivity felt thin. As dusk settled, painting the room in hues of orange and deep purple, Julian leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms over his head. "Enough work," he declared. "Let's open that wine the client sent." We sat on the sofa in front of the fire, sipping a ridiculously expensive Merlot from mismatched mugs. The heat from the flames warmed my face, and the wine began to loosen the knot of anxiety in my chest. The conversation was light at first, about work, about the city. But then Julian shifted, turning to face me, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. "You're always so quiet about yourself, Leo," he said, his voice a low murmur. "All these years, and I know you do brilliant work, and you like your coffee black. That's about it." He took a sip of wine, his eyes never leaving mine over the rim of the mug. "Anyone special waiting for you back home?" The question was a perfectly aimed dart, striking the very center of my carefully guarded privacy. It was a casual question, the kind people ask all the time. But from him, in this place, it felt loaded. It felt like a test. "No," I said, the word coming out quieter than I intended. I focused on the fire, unable to meet his gaze. "No one. A guy as talented and thoughtful as you," he pressed gently. I find that hard to believe. Thoughtful. He had called me thoughtful. My heart did a painful lurch. This is where I should say something about being busy with work, make a light joke, deflect. But the wine, the fire, and the overwhelming proximity of him had worn down my defenses. "Just haven't met the right person, I guess," I mumbled, which wasn't exactly a lie. "Or maybe you have," Julian said, his voice dropping even lower, "and you just don't think you have a chance." My breath hitched. I finally forced myself to look at him. His expression was intense, searching. The unreadable mask was gone, replaced by an open, raw curiosity. The subtext was no longer subtext. It was a screaming, flashing neon sign in the middle of the quiet cabin. He was talking about us. He had to be. But my brain, so conditioned for disappointment, refused to believe it. This was a misunderstanding. A cruel joke played by the firelight and the wine. I couldn't speak. I just stared at him, my mind a static-filled television screen. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackling of the logs. It felt like hours, like the entire world had paused, waiting for my response. Sleep was an impossibility. I lay in my bed, rigid, staring up at the dark wooden beams of the ceiling. Every creak of the cabin, every sigh of the wind outside, sounded unnaturally loud. Julian's breathing from the other side of the room was a steady, rhythmic torture. He had fallen asleep, or was pretending to, almost immediately after our conversation had died an awkward death. I had mumbled something about being tired and retreated to my bed, my skin feeling hot and my mind racing. "Or maybe you have, and you just don't think you have a chance." The words replayed over and over. What did he mean? Was he just being a perceptive, slightly invasive boss? Or was it more? The ambiguity was killing me. I felt suspended between a terrifying hope and my usual, comfortable despair. Hours passed. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, pulsing light across the room. I was so thirsty. My throat was as dry as sand. Quietly, I slipped out of bed, my bare feet cold on the wood floor. I tiptoed to the small kitchen area, trying not to make a sound. As I filled a glass with water from the tap, a voice from the darkness made me jump so hard I nearly dropped it. "Can't sleep?" I spun around. Julian was sitting up in his bed, a silhouette against the faint glow of the dying fire. I couldn't see his expression. "No," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Just getting some water." "Me neither," he said. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood up. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt and flannel pants, and even in the dim light, his presence filled the space. He walked towards me, stopping a few feet away. The silence was back, but this time it was different. It was heavy, charged, a held breath before a storm. I couldn't take it anymore. The tension, the hope, the fear, it was a toxic cocktail, and it was about to make me combust. I had to end it. I had to go back to my gray box, where things were safe and nothing ever happened. "I can't do this, Julian," I blurted out, the words tumbling out in a rush. "This weekend, this cabin, I should have just said I was sick. I can work from the lobby tomorrow. I'm sorry." He was still, a statue in the dark. "Do what, Leo?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. This? I gestured vaguely between us, the space crackling with everything I couldn't say. Pretend. Pretend that I'm not completely, utterly affected by you. Pretend that working next to you for a week hasn't undone 5 years of me, trying to be invisible. I can't. My voice broke on the last word. It was all out there now. A messy, desperate confession hanging in the air. I braced myself for the rejection, for the pity, for the awkward HR meeting that was surely in my future. He didn't say anything. He just closed the distance between us in 2 silent steps. The air shifted. He raised a hand, and I flinched, expecting a placating pat on the shoulder, a gesture of dismissal. Instead, his fingers came to rest against my cheek. His skin was warm. His thumb gently stroked my jawline, a gesture of such profound tenderness it stole the air from my lungs. "Leo," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that I felt more than heard. He leaned in closer, his forehead coming to rest against mine. I could feel his breath on my lips. Who said I was straight? The question shattered my entire reality. It was a key turning in a lock I never even knew existed. Every look, every touch, every ambiguous word from the past week rearranged itself in my mind, shifting from confusing to crystal clear. The hand on my shoulder, the foot against my shoe, the questions by the fire. It wasn't in my head. And then he kissed me. It wasn't a kiss of frantic passion or pent-up lust. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was a question and an answer all at once. His lips were soft, hesitant at first, and then they pressed against mine with a sense of rightness, of coming home. I melted into him, my hands coming up to grip his t-shirt as if I were afraid he might disappear. All the tension, all the fear, all the years of silent yearning drained out of me, replaced by a wave of dizzying, overwhelming relief. It was honest. It was real. He tasted of expensive red wine and a truth I had been too scared to even dream of. When we finally broke apart, we just stood there in the near darkness, foreheads pressed together, breathing the same air. The silence was no longer empty. It was full. I woke to the pale, watery light of dawn filtering through the cabin window. For a blissful, disoriented second, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Then memory came rushing back, and with it, a cold, sharp panic. I was in a cabin with my boss. I had kissed my boss. My boss had kissed me back. I turned my head slowly. Julian's bed was empty. The panic intensified, clawing its way up my throat. He was gone. He'd woken up, realized what a colossal mistake he'd made, and fled. I had misread everything. He was just being kind, and I, in my desperate loneliness, had projected a fantasy onto him, forcing him into a situation he now regretted. I had ruined my job, my career, my one safe space. I squeezed my eyes shut, the humiliation a physical weight on my chest. The quiet of the cabin, which had felt so intimate last night, now felt vast and accusing. I heard a soft click. The cabin door opened, and Julian walked in, carrying 2 steaming mugs. He was already dressed in jeans and a sweater, his hair damp. He must have gone for a walk. Or a run. Probably a run, to escape the suffocating awkwardness he no doubt felt. He saw I was awake and his steps faltered for a fraction of a second. The morning after awkwardness descended, thick and palpable. He avoided my eyes, busying himself by placing the mugs on the table. "Coffee," he said to the room at large. "Thanks," I mumbled to the blankets. I sat up, my body feeling stiff and foreign. I couldn't look at him. I just stared at the intricate patterns of the wood grain on the floor, bracing myself for the inevitable "we need to talk" speech. The one that would begin with, "Leo, you're a great designer," and end with me cleaning out my desk. The silence stretched, agonizing. I could hear him moving, the soft sound of his footsteps, the clink of a spoon. I finally risked a glance. He was standing by the fireplace, his back to me, staring into the cold hearth. He took a deep breath, the sound echoing in the quiet room, and then he turned around. He walked over to me, his expression serious. "This is it," I thought. "Here it comes." He didn't speak. Instead, he reached down, took my coffee mug from my trembling hand, and placed it on the bedside table. Then he sat on the edge of my bed, took my hand in both of his, and just held it. His hands were warm and strong, engulfing mine completely. "Last night," he said, his voice quiet but firm, forcing me to meet his gaze. Was not a mistake. I stared at him, my brain struggling to process the words. I've wanted that for a long time, Leo, he continued, his thumb stroking the back of my hand. Longer than you think, he offered a small, wry smile. I'm not good at this. The personal side of things. I keep my life compartmentalized. It's easier. Safer. He looked down at our joined hands. The straight boss thing, it was a useful shield. For both of us, I think. He was right. I had used it as a shield, too. A way to keep my feelings safely locked away in the realm of the impossible. I woke up this morning, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. And for the first time in I don't know how long, I felt calm. He looked up at me, his eyes dark and sincere. I'm not going to pretend I have this all figured out. But I'm not running. And I'm not sorry. The sincerity in his voice was a balm, soothing the raw edges of my panic. It wasn't a grand declaration of love, but it was something far better. It was a quiet, steady reassurance. It was real. Returning to the office on Monday was the real test. We drove back in a comfortable, if slightly charged, silence. We agreed, without explicitly saying it, to keep things professional at work. Our secret was a fragile, new thing, and the harsh fluorescent lights of the office felt like a threat to it. Walking through the door felt like stepping onto a stage. Every good morning, every curious glance felt loaded with meaning. I retreated to my gray corner, trying to act normal, but my skin was buzzing. Late in the afternoon, a smarmy sales guy named Rick swaggered over to the design pit to gloat about the Omnicorp win. He leaned against my desk, crossing his arms. Heard you and the big boss got real cozy up at the Love Shack, he said with a wink. My blood froze. Had to share a cabin, right? Hope you guys didn't get up to anything I wouldn't do, he laughed, a loud, braying sound. I tensed, ready for the familiar flush of shame. But before I could even form a response, Julian's voice cut through the air, cool and sharp as glass. Do you have a question about the project, Rick? Rick straightened up, his smirk faltering. Julian was standing at the entrance to the design area, his arms crossed, his expression unyielding. He hadn't raised his voice, but the authority in it was absolute. No, boss. Just congratulating the team, Rick stammered. Good, Julian said, his eyes like chips of ice. Then I suggest you get back to your desk and start working on the deliverables. We're on a tight deadline. It was a clear dismissal. Rick scurried away like a chastened dog. Julian's gaze met mine for a brief, searing moment. It was a look of pure, undiluted protection. He was standing with me. Still. Weeks passed. The initial high-wire act of our new reality slowly settled into a comfortable rhythm. We were discreet, professional. Our relationship lived in the margins, in lingering glances across the boardroom, in late-night texts that had nothing to do with work, in the shared smile when we passed in the hallway. It was a secret language, spoken only by us. The Omnicorp project was a resounding success. The frantic energy in the office subsided, replaced by the normal hum of business. One evening, I was working late, finishing up a minor revision. The office was quiet, empty. I was lost in my work when I sensed him, that familiar shadow falling over my desk. I looked up. Julian was there, not in his suit, but in a soft Henley jeans. He didn't say anything about work. He just looked at me, a soft smile playing on his lips. Then, he reached into his pocket and placed a single, old-fashioned brass key on my desk. It landed with a soft, definitive clink. My cabin, he said, his voice low. The booking error wasn't an error, my breath caught. He had orchestrated the whole thing. The forced proximity, the weekend that had changed everything. I bought the place last year. It's my escape. He pushed the key slightly closer to me. And the key is yours now, too. If you want it. It wasn't just a key. It was an invitation. An offer. A tangible symbol of a shared future, of a space that could be ours, away from the prying eyes of the world. I looked from the key to his face, at the hopeful, vulnerable expression in his eyes. I want it, I said, my voice thick with emotion. We are back at the cabin. It's Saturday. There are no clients, no deadlines, no pretense. The air smells of pine and wood smoke, a scent I now associate with peace. I'm chopping vegetables at the small kitchen counter, and Julian is searing steaks on the stove. We move around each other in the small space with an easy, unspoken choreography, a domestic dance we're learning together. The silence isn't tense or awkward. It's a comfortable, warm blanket. It feels like home. Later, we sit on the sofa in front of a roaring fire, a bottle of wine shared between us. He's not wearing a suit or a boss's unreadable mask. He's just Julian, his head resting in my lap, his eyes closed as I run my fingers through his hair. I watch the firelight play across his relaxed face, and I think about the man I was just a few months ago, the anxious, invisible man in the gray suit, with the shaking hands and the hopeless crush. I am no longer that man. I am no longer an observer of my own life, watching from the safety of the sidelines. I am here, in the heart of it, feeling the solid weight of his head in my lap, the soft texture of his hair beneath my fingers, the steady rhythm of his breathing. This straight boss was a story, a label I'd used to protect myself from the terrifying possibility of hope. Julian was right. You just have to decide to tell a different story. He stirs, opening his eyes. He looks up at me, his gaze soft and full of a quiet affection that still makes my heart ache in the best possible way. He doesn't say anything. He just reaches up and takes my hand, lacing his fingers through mine. His grip is firm, solid, real. I look from our joined hands to the dancing flames. The gray has bled from my world, replaced by the warm, vibrant colors of the fire. Replaced by him. I squeeze his hand, and for the first time, I feel completely, utterly seen.